At 06:15 on the morning of July 30th, 1943, the airfield at RAF Kimballton was already awake. Engines idled in the half-light, their low rumble rolling across the concrete like distant thunder. Ground crews moved with practiced urgency beneath the wings of parked bombers, their breath visible in the cool English air. Above them, the sky was a flat, dull gray, neither night nor day, an in-between hour that offered no comfort and no concealment. This was not an unusual sight. Hundreds of missions had launched from these same runways over the past months. What made this morning different was not ceremony or speech, but arithmetic. The numbers were already against them. The aircraft assigned to the mission would climb to an altitude of more than 25,000 feet, high enough that the temperature outside the fuselage would plunge to 60 degrees below zero. At that height, exposed skin froze in seconds. Metal became brittle. Oxygen thinned to the point where a faulty mask or ruptured line could mean unconsciousness, then death, long before a man ever saw the enemy. The mission itself would carry the bomber stream more than 500 miles into occupied Europe, across the English Channel, over France, over Belgium, and finally, deep into Germany. For most of that distance, they would fly without fire escort. Fuel limitations meant protection would peel away long before the bombers reached their target. The final hours would be spent alone. The Luftwaffe knew this. German fighter controllers had spent weeks studying American flight paths, calculating timing, predicting altitude, identifying the exact moment when escort fighters would be forced to turn back. Along the expected route, hundreds of interceptors had been positioned at forward airfields, warmed, fueled, and ready. When the bombers crossed that invisible line of no return, the fighters would rise to meet them. Everyone involved understood what that meant. By the summer of 1943, the 8th Air Force had learned its lessons the hard way. Bombing missions over Germany were not battles of chance. They were controlled slaughters governed by statistics that grew more unforgiving with every sortie. Crews tracked their own survival odds with grim clarity. 11 missions. That was the average lifespan of a bomber crew before they were shot down, killed, or captured. Some lasted less. Very few lasted longer. On this morning, the aircraft rolling toward the runway carried men already well past the halfway point of that average. Inside the aluminum fuselage, there was no room for comfort. No place to stand upright. No space to move freely. Each crew member occupied a specific station, bound by harnesses, oxygen hoses, intercom wires, and the thin walls of the aircraft itself. Once airborne, there would be no escape from those kinds for hours at a time. At the very rear of the bomber sat the most isolated position of all. The tail compartment was barely large enough for one man. A narrow cylinder of plexiglass and metal, just wide enough to turn a shoulder, just tall enough to crouch. 2 machine guns pointed backward through a clear dome that offered an unobstructed view of the sky and almost no protection from it. The rest of the crew was 40 feet away, separated by bulkheads and equipment, their voices reduced to faint crackles over the intercom. If something went wrong back there, there would be no help. The tail gunner knew this every time he climbed into position. He knew that German pilots preferred attacking from behind, where the geometry favored them. Approaching from the 6 o'clock position gave fighters the longest firing window and the clearest shot at control surfaces, engines, and the gunner himself. The first bullets almost always went through the tail. By mid-1943, the nickname for the position was already established: the loneliest job in the war. As the bomber lifted off the runway and clawed into the gray sky, England began to fall away beneath it. Fields shrank into patchwork. Rivers became thin lines. The white cliffs of Dover appeared briefly off the wing, then faded into haze as the formation turned southeast toward open water. Below, the English Channel waited. Crossing it was not yet dangerous, but it marked the start of the clock. From that point forward, every mile flown was a mile deeper into hostile territory. Every minute brought them closer to interception. There would be no turning back without orders, no deviation without consequence. The formation climbed steadily, engines straining as altitude increased. Condensation trails began to form, thin white lines stretching behind each aircraft like signatures written across the sky, beautiful from a distance, a beacon to anyone watching from below. Inside the tail compartment, the view was uninterrupted. Nothing but sky and contrails and the faint shapes of other bombers holding formation. No landmarks, no ground. Just open space where enemy fighters could appear at any moment. Training manuals described this phase of the mission as routine. Combat veterans knew better. Routine was an illusion that existed only until the first enemy appeared. German radar stations along the coast had already detected the bomber stream. Fighter units were scrambling, even as the bombers settled into cruising altitude. By the time the formation reached occupied France, interceptor groups would be climbing to meet them, timing their approach to coincide with the moment of maximum vulnerability. The escort fighters stayed close for now, weaving protectively around the bombers, their presence a visible reminder that survival was still possible. But every man aboard understood the limitation. Fuel gauges would soon dictate withdrawal. When that happened, the escorts would peel away with a waggle of wings, leaving the bombers to continue on alone. That moment was approaching. As the bomber crossed into enemy airspace, the sense of distance sharpened. France passed beneath them quickly, fields and towns sliding by in silence. Flak batteries remained mostly quiet for now, conserving ammunition for the return flight or the bombing run itself. The real danger lay ahead, above, and behind. The tail gunner watched constantly, scanning sectors of empty sky, knowing that the first sign of attack might be nothing more than a flicker of movement or a dark speck, growing larger with terrifying speed. At closing velocities approaching 600 miles per hour, recognition and reaction time collapsed into seconds. There would be no warning siren, no dramatic signal, just sudden violence. As the formation pressed onward, the escorts finally began to fall back. One by one, the fighters peeled away, their silhouettes shrinking until they disappeared entirely. The bombers continued forward, engines steady, formation tight. Now they were truly alone. Somewhere ahead, German pilots were already climbing, calculating angles, choosing targets. They knew the Americans would hold formation. They knew where the guns were mounted. They knew the doctrine the gunners had been taught. The Americans knew the statistics. And as the bomber stream pushed deeper into hostile airspace, the mission crossed a threshold that could not be reversed. From this point forward, survival would depend not on planning or preparation, but on decisions made in seconds, decisions the training could not fully anticipate. The sky behind the formation remained empty. For now, but every man aboard understood that the silence would not last, and when it broke, it would do so violently, without warning and without mercy. The tail compartment was not a station so much as a cage. Once the bomber leveled out and the vibration settled into a constant, mechanical hum, the world behind the aircraft became everything. Sky, contrails, empty distance. The rest of the crew might as well have been on another plane. 40 feet of aluminum fuselage separated the tail from the nearest human voice, and even that voice arrived through a wire-thin crackling, delayed by static and engine noise. The man assigned to the position climbed backward into it on hands and knees. There was no graceful way to enter, no room to stand upright. His shoulders brushed the sides as he wriggled into place, knees bent, back hunched, boots wedged against metal ribs. He settled onto a narrow bicycle-style seat bolted to the floor, the kind of seat designed for minutes, not hours. At altitude, time stretched. At 25,000 feet, the bomber became two environments at once. Up front, men worked within the main compartment, passing through narrow walkways, checking engines, monitoring instruments, moving as much as the aircraft allowed. In the tail, movement stopped being an option. Once you were seated, you stayed seated. If a line tangled, if a weapon jammed, if the oxygen hose snagged on something, you dealt with it alone, inches from where you already sat. There was no space for a second set of hands. The tail gunner lived inside constraints, physical, mechanical, procedural. 2 heavy machine guns bracketed his field of view. The plexiglass dome curved around him, clear enough to see the sky, fragile enough that a single hit could turn it into flying shards. In winter, it iced along the edges. In summer, it fogged with condensation. Either way, it was never as clear as training videos pretended. The guns pointed backward through fixed arcs. He could traverse them left and right, elevate and depress them, but only within the limits of their mounts. The bomber's tail surfaces, the stabilizers and rudder, blocked portions of the view. Every weapon system had dead zones. Every dead zone was an invitation to an enemy pilot who understood geometry better than fear. The Germans understood geometry. They had been fighting bombers for years. They knew where American guns were positioned and how long it took to swing a mount onto a target. They knew the behavior of bomber formations, how they held steady, how they could not turn sharply without breaking the box, how an individual aircraft that fell out of formation became a target that would not survive. And they knew something else: doctrine. American gunnery training, especially early in the air war, was built on restraint. Conserve ammunition. Fire only when the target fills the sight picture. Wait until the fighter is within 300 yards. Short controlled bursts. Accuracy over volume. In a classroom, it sounded rational. In the air, it collided with reality. The problem was not bravery. It was physics. A fighter approaching from directly behind could close the distance faster than the mind wanted to accept. At the combined speeds involved, the window between I see him and he's firing could be seconds. A tail gunner had to identify the threat, estimate range, adjust lead, and fire all while the aircraft shook from turbulence and the enemy changed angle to avoid being hit. The training assumed the enemy would cooperate by flying straight and staying predictable. The Luftwaffe did not cooperate. German pilots attacked from beyond 300 yards because they had learned the Americans would not fire. They opened up with cannon at long range, sending shells into bomber formations while the gunners sat with fingers disciplined off the triggers. By the time the fighter closed into the authorized zone, damage had already been done. Control cables severed. Hydraulics punctured. Plexiglass shattered. Men in the tail compartment killed before they ever fired a shot. The tail gunner was expected to be patient. Patience, in that position, could get you killed. He watched the empty sky with that knowledge sitting in the back of his throat like a taste he couldn't swallow. He didn't need a speech to understand the job. The bomber's vibration ran through the seat into his spine. The cold seeped in from the outside despite the heated suit. Fingers stiffened. Breathing became deliberate, oxygen-fed, and dry. Every adjustment of the guns reminded him that even his movements were mechanical, limited by pivots and stops. Above him, the bomber's contrails were visible in the dome's curved, bright white lines stretching backward, advertising the formation's presence to anyone who looked up. A trail to follow. A path to intercept. The bombers could not hide. They were too large and too high and too predictable. The tail gunner sat at the end of that path. If the formation was a moving target, he was the point the enemy would naturally aim for first. Not because he mattered more than anyone else, but because killing him opened the door. A bomber without tail protection could be attacked again and again from the rear, with less risk. The fighter pilots knew that. The gunners knew that. Everyone knew that. This was why they called it the loneliest job. Not because you were physically alone, though you were. Not because you couldn't speak, though sometimes the intercom was filled with nothing but static. It was lonely because the danger belonged to you first. If the enemy came from behind, you would see it first. You would be hit first. You would be tested first. And if you failed, the rest of the crew would pay for it. A man could carry that responsibility without ever saying a word about it. The bomber droned onward through thin cloud and pale sunlight, deeper into occupied airspace, and the tail gunner kept watching. He checked his oxygen line, shifted his weight slightly to keep circulation in his legs, flexed his fingers against the growing stiffness. He glanced at the ammunition feeds, the belts of rounds linked and waiting, neat in their trays, finite and precious. 800 rounds could disappear quickly. A mission could turn that supply into nothing but empty links and hot barrels long before the bomber turned for home. Training treated ammunition as something to be protected from waste. The tail compartment treated it as time. Each burst was seconds bought. Each second might be the difference between another attack run and a fire breaking away. The manuals promised a way to survive if you followed instructions. But the sky did not care about manuals. It cared about angles, speed, range, and reaction time. It cared about who saw whom first, who fired first, who forced the other to flinch. The gunner understood that with a clarity that didn't require heroism to explain. He sat in a space barely larger than his own body, surrounded by thin plexiglass and colder air than any human was meant to endure, knowing that the first true test of the day would not come over the target. It would come on the way there. And when it did, there would be no one behind him to help. No one to share the decision. No one to absorb the first impact. Just one man at the end of a bomber, watching the empty sky, waiting for it to stop being empty. The first sign of the enemy did not come with noise or warning. It appeared as movement. A dark speck, barely distinguishable from the scattered shadows of contrails and cloud fragments, rose into view far behind the formation. Then another, then several more. They were distant enough to be almost abstract, small enough that the mind resisted assigning meaning to them. At that range, it was easy to believe they were nothing, easy to hope. The tail gunner did not have that luxury. He leaned forward slightly in the narrow seat, bringing his eyes closer to the sight, forcing focus. The specks grew larger, their motion no longer ambiguous. They were climbing, angling upward with intent, positioning themselves behind the bomber's path. They were not rushing. They were patient. That patience was deliberate. German fighter pilots had learned that haste was unnecessary. The bombers would not turn. They could not scatter without orders. Formation discipline was their shield and their trap. The fighters could take their time, set their angles, choose the moment that maximized exposure and minimized risk. The gunner knew what the manual said he should do next. Wait. The doctrine was clear and had been drilled into him until it felt automatic. Do not waste ammunition. Do not fire at extreme range. Hold your fire until the enemy is close enough that you cannot miss. 300 yards, no more. At that distance, every round mattered. At that distance, accuracy compensated for fear. The doctrine had reasons. Ammunition was finite. Resupply did not exist at 25,000 feet. A gunner who emptied his belts too early became irrelevant later, when the bomber was slower, lower, and more vulnerable on the return flight. Discipline preserved combat power. Discipline saved crews. On paper. In the air, the paper worked. The fighters continued to close. Their silhouettes sharpened, resolving into distinct shapes, wings, fuselages, the unmistakable geometry of single-engine interceptors aligning themselves for a classic rear attack. They were coming in from slightly above, using gravity to build speed, reducing the time they would spend in the gunner's effective arc. The gunner tracked them through the sight. He could already see details the manual insisted he ignore at this range. The wings were level. The nose was pointed directly at him. The approach was steady, confident, practiced. They were not firing yet. They did not need to. At this distance, the German pilots knew they were safe. They had learned that American tail gunners would hold their fire, that they would wait for permission, granted by doctrine rather than reality. The Luftwaffe had studied this behavior and built tactics around it, exploiting the pause, exploiting the delay, exploiting the obedience. The gunner felt the weight of that obedience pressing down on him now. He glanced instinctively at the ammunition feed, the linked rounds resting in their tray. 800 of them. The number sounded generous in a briefing room. In combat, it fractured quickly. Divide it by the number of attacks a mission might face. Divide it again by the rounds per burst needed to have any effect. The margin shrank with brutal speed. If he fired now, he would burn ammunition the Doctrine insisted he could not afford to lose. If he waited, he might not get another chance. The distance closed. The fighters were still beyond 300 yards. Still officially out of bounds. Still, according to the manual, untouchable. But the gunner could see the problem clearly now, stripped of theory. The fighters were presenting the largest possible target they ever would. Head on from the rear, wings broad, closure rate high but predictable. Every second they flew straight made them easier to track. Every second closer they came, the more dangerous they became. This was the paradox the manual did not solve. The safest moment to fire was also the moment you were forbidden to act. He had seen what happened when gunners waited. Bombers falling out of formation, trailing smoke. Parachutes blooming beneath them, sometimes too few, sometimes none at all. Tail compartments shattered before a single trigger was pulled. Men killed with their guns silent, obedience intact to the end. Those memories pressed in now, heavier than training films or classroom lectures. The fighters crossed an invisible threshold in his mind, not the 300 yards of Doctrine, but the point where waiting no longer felt disciplined, only passive. The moment where restraint stopped being professionalism and became surrender. He made his decision. It was not impulsive. It was not fueled by panic. It came with a strange calm, the kind that settles in when doubt finally gives way to resolve. He adjusted his grip, brought the guns onto the lead aircraft, and squeezed the triggers. The Brownings roared to life. The sound filled the tail compartment instantly, violent and consuming. The aircraft shuddered slightly as the gun cycled, brass casings ejecting, links rattling loose. Tracers streaked out into empty air, arcing downward at first, falling short as physics demanded. The gunner watched them closely, not the fighters. He adjusted his aim, walking the fire upward, compensating for distance and closure rate. The tracers climbed, reaching farther with each burst. The fighters were no longer abstract shapes. They were reacting now. The lead pilot saw the fire coming. That alone was a rupture. This was not how the engagement was supposed to go. The German pilot had expected silence until the last moments, expected to line up his shot uncontested. Instead, bright lines of tracer reached toward him far earlier than anticipated, forcing a choice he had not planned to make. Rig off or press on. The pilot broke away. He rolled hard, diving out of the approach path, abandoning the attack before firing a single round. His wingman followed, not because he was hit, but because the geometry of the attack had been destroyed. The window had closed. The gunner released the triggers. The sky behind the bomber was empty again. But the silence felt different now. The decision had been made, and it could not be unmade. Ammunition had been spent. Doctrine had been violated. The manual would not forgive that. Other gunners might not forgive it either. Crew chiefs would notice the expenditure. Officers would ask questions. Those consequences lay ahead. For now, the immediate result was undeniable. The bomber was still intact. The fighters had been denied their preferred attack. The formation held. The gunner did not celebrate. He checked the ammunition count automatically, noting how quickly the number had dropped. The cost was real. He would pay it later, one way or another. There was no illusion about that. He returned his focus to the sky, because one broken attack did not mean safety. It meant adaptation. The Luftwaffe pilots would learn. They always did. They would adjust approach angles, speeds, formations. They would probe for weaknesses, test whether this early fire was a fluke or a pattern. If it was a pattern, they would respond with violence. The gunner understood that too. By choosing to fire early, he had stepped outside the protection of doctrine and into a personal gamble. From this point forward, survival depended on judgment rather than instruction, on reading intent rather than following rules, on deciding, again and again, when to act and when to conserve. There was no going back to the comfort of waiting. The manuals were written by men who wanted to impose order on chaos. The sky did not care about order. It cared about speed, angle, and who forced the other to react first. The gunner had forced that reaction. The cost would come later. But in this moment, as the bomber pressed onward and the fighters regrouped somewhere out of sight, the meaning of the decision settled in with quiet clarity. Survival was no longer something that happened to him. It was something he had chosen to fight for on his own terms, knowing full well that the rules he had broken were there to protect him, and knowing just as clearly that obeying them might have killed him instead. The bomber did not land to cheers. When the wheels finally touched the runway hours later, the aircraft rolled to a stop like hundreds before it, engines coughing, metal ticking as it cooled. Ground crews rushed in, not to celebrate, but to assess damage. Holes were counted, control surfaces inspected, fuel leaks traced. Blood frozen into the seams of the fuselage was scraped away without comment. Survival in this war was procedural. Inside the aircraft, the crew climbed out slowly, stiff and exhausted, faces marked by oxygen masks and hours of strain. There were questions, of course, about damage, about encounters, about how close it had come. The answers were brief, professional, stripped of emotion. There was no room for drama in an environment where tomorrow's mission briefing was already being prepared. In the tail section, the ammunition belts told a quiet story. Far fewer rounds than expected remained. The count stood out immediately. It would be written down, noted, questioned. Deviations from doctrine always were. The gunnery officer saw it first. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He simply asked why. The explanation was not dramatic. It did not involve speeches or claims of heroism. It was practical. It was mathematical. Fighters broke off when fired upon early. Attacks disrupted before cannon range. Fewer hits taken. The bomber returned intact. The answer was not entirely satisfactory. Doctrine existed for reasons. Ammunition expenditure was tracked because it mattered. A single gunner firing freely might survive one mission only to leave his aircraft defenseless later. The manuals were written to protect crews over time, not in isolated moments. And yet, the aircraft had returned. Not just once, but repeatedly. Mission after mission, the pattern held. Early fire did not eliminate danger, but it altered it. German fighters adjusted sooner. Attack runs broke earlier. Pilots maneuvered defensively rather than lining up perfect shots. The bomber took damage, but less of it. Crews survived encounters that previously would have ended differently. This was not a revelation. It was an accumulation. Intelligence officers noticed. So did statisticians. They did not speak in terms of bravery or innovation. They spoke in charts and tables, loss rates, damage reports, correlations between engagement distance and aircraft survival. No single mission proved anything, but dozens began to suggest a trend. The air war over Europe was not static. It was a contest of adaptation. The Germans noticed the change as well. Captured pilots mentioned it in debriefings. Long-range tracer fire made rear attacks less predictable. The psychological effect mattered as much as the physical one. A pilot forced to maneuver early lost accuracy, lost timing, lost confidence. Even when rounds fell short, the sight of fire reaching out sooner than expected disrupted the carefully calculated geometry of an attack. The Luftwaffe adjusted. They always did. Faster approaches, steeper dives, different angles. Concentrated assaults against single formations rather than dispersed harassment. But each adjustment carried its own costs. Higher speeds reduced firing windows. Steeper dives increased the difficulty of recovery. Concentration made formations more visible, more vulnerable to coordinated defensive fire. There was no perfect answer, only trade-offs. Back on the Allied side, those same trade-offs were being studied. Reports moved upward through channels that rarely moved quickly. Gunnery officers forwarded observations. Group commanders added notes. Analysts compared units that tolerated early engagement with those that enforced strict adherence to manuals. The conclusions were cautious, as bureaucracy demanded. But they were clear enough. By late summer, revised guidance began circulating, not loudly, not publicly. Language softened the shift. Authorized under certain conditions, at the discretion of the gunner, when tactical circumstances permit. The meaning was unmistakable. What had once been forbidden was now allowed. No announcement marked the change. No ceremony. Doctrine does not rewrite itself with fanfare. It changes quietly, through footnotes and amended paragraphs, through instructions passed down in briefings that lost only minutes. For the men flying the missions, the effect was immediate. Gunners fired earlier. Fighters broke off sooner. Bombers returned with fewer holes. Losses did not vanish. War does not allow that, but survival improved at the margins where it mattered most. And the man whose decision had helped nudge that shift forward did not stand at the center of it. He recovered from his wounds away from the spotlight. Medical officers cleared him, then grounded him again. Head injuries lingered. Vision blurred. Headaches persisted. Combat flying was no longer an option. His war ended quietly, not with a final mission, but with paperwork. Medals arrived later. Distinguished awards. Citations written in formal language that flattened chaos into sentences. They spoke of gallantry, of intrepidity, of devotion to duty. They spoke of gallantry, of intrepidity, of devotion to duty. They did not mention the doubt that preceded the decision or the weight of breaking rules designed to keep men alive. He accepted the decorations without comment. When his service ended, he did not become a symbol. He did not tour. He did not speak publicly about what he had done. Like many men of his generation, he carried the war inward and moved on. He stayed in uniform longer than most. Not out of glory, but familiarity, purpose. Teaching others what experience had taught him, without insisting they remember his name. When he finally left military service, he did so without ceremony. The years passed. Bombers were retired, airfields closed or repurposed. The doctrines that had once been controversial became standard, then outdated, then historical. New aircraft replaced old ones. New wars produced new manuals. The man faded from public view. His name appeared in archives, in mission reports, in footnotes of studies examining how air combat had evolved. Researchers could trace the lineage of certain practices back through documents that bore his influence, though rarely his credit. That was how war remembered him. Not as a figure carved in stone, but as a set of decisions embedded in systems that outlived him. When he died, the notice was brief: rank, service branch, dates. The stone that marked his grave listed none of the choices he had made under pressure, none of the rules he had broken, none of the lives that quietly continued because of it. Military cemeteries are full of such silences. They mark where people rest, not what they changed, and yet the impact remained. In every bomber crew that returned with fewer casualties, in every pilot who broke off an attack sooner than planned, in every doctrine rewritten not because someone sought recognition, but because someone refused to wait when waiting no longer made sense. The air war moved on. History did too. But beneath the layers of policy and procedure, the truth endured. Wars are shaped not only by commands issued from above, but by individuals who recognize when rules have stopped matching reality and accept the cost of acting anyway. That kind of decision rarely comes with applause. It comes with consequences, carried quietly, long after the sky is emptied and the engines have gone silent.